So, how about today we just dive right in? Yeah? The Fae have a very different ethical code than we do. Fairy is a different kind of place and it operates under very different rules. So, I thought as we start delving into the missing 411 National Park cases and the connection between those cases and traditional fairy lore, I thought it would be interesting to look at what some of this traditional fairy lore says about the do's and don'ts of interacting with the Fae. Just as a reminder, for those who are not familiar, I am personally most familiar with like Celtic fairy lore, but I also use fairy as an umbrella term because really every culture around the world throughout all of human history has had stories of these types of entities. I don't really know what they are. The more that I have learned about them, the more questions I have. But there's definitely something weird going on. And that's kind of what I want this whole series to be about. So let's look at some of these guidelines for how to conduct ourselves when dealing with Fae and see maybe what we can glean from that. It's really interesting stuff to think about. So, thanks for being here. First things first, never, for any reason, tell a fairy your real name. You can give them a fake name. You can create a name specifically for when you are dealing with them, but you never want to share your real name because names have power. When we're speaking, especially, metaphysically or when we're dealing in the occult, even, no matter what type of occult perspective you have, like even if you are Christian, think of a Catholic priest. He's called to do an exorcism, right? But he cannot exorcise a demon from the person it's possessing until he has the name of the demon, right? There is power in names. And so you can also expect by that same token, a fairy will probably never give you its real name either. And if this does happen, if it ever does become safe to do so, it is after a very, very long, committed relationship with that fairy. That is the only way to make that happen. But typically, you are urged to be cautious. So, because also the type of the level of power that giving your name to a fairy would give them over you is really dependent on the type of fairy that you might be interacting with. And because fairies are tricksters, it can sometimes be hard to tell. So, again, be cautious. Now, something else to keep in mind, accepting gifts from a fairy is essentially the same thing in their perspective as entering a contract with them. So, and the reason that that's considered a dangerous thing is because a fairy might give you something like a really pretty stone, right? You might find a stone like that while you're hiking around or whatever, and you just know that it's from the fairies, right? But if you accept that gift, you're entering a contract with them. And so by entering that contract, even though it's a small stone, you don't necessarily know what the Fae are expecting in return. And a lot of the times, entering a contract in that way, it's going to work in the favor of the fairy. They're the ones who decide when your contract has been fulfilled and how it is fulfilled. And so you don't necessarily know how that's going to come about, and it might not be something that you're necessarily willing to give to them. You understand? So be very cautious. That being said, you can leave as many offerings to the Fae as you want, and it will actually help to earn their favor and or appease them depending on what the situation is. So, you can leave, and every type of fairy has different things it prefers, but it is generally considered that like all fairy entities like sweet things. Honey and milk are also specifically recommended for like blanket fairy offering kind of thing. All right. But like even like hard little sweet candies, just don't leave any kind of offering to them that obviously is just litter. And you're like, don't litter, don't leave anything trashy. Like make sure that it's biodegradable or something natural, right? Like even if you're leaving a really pretty stone that's been polished by humans to make it shinier or something, that's a great gift. But it's not like something that is going to damage the natural environment or be insulting to the land spirits. Okay. Um, by that same token, especially here in North America, I can't speak to necessarily other countries, I don't know, but I know here in North America, there are some things, like be cautious if you're on native, indigenous lands. Make sure you're not leaving something that, on like native lands that might be offensive to the indigenous people. Just wanted to throw that out there. You never know. Um, so, going through my list here. Lying. Fairies hate liars, all right? Never lie to a fairy. Now, I will say if you're having some kind of communication with them, they are very quick-witted, very silver-tongued. They love riddles. They love games. Even the nice fairies like to play games. And since they are non-corporeal entities that have never had physical forms, they don't necessarily understand the same dangers that we might, uh, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm wording that very well. But something that they might find a fun game might be really, really dangerous to us, if that makes sense. So, but yeah, they also, again, with the riddles and the game playing and the straight up not so nice fairies, like that's a nice way of putting it. The ones that hate humans might still want to play games. So, and they might have just downright manipulative, malicious intentions. So you have to be very cautious in your communication with them, but they will never, ever lie to you. You just have to be alert and really, really clear minded when dealing with them so that you don't accidentally do something you don't mean to do, right? Enter into some kind of contract you don't mean to enter into, right? Just be very, very cautious. In that same vein, always keep your word. Even if it's not like a promise, even if you don't specifically say, I promise I'll do this, or I vow to do this, or something like that, right? Even if you're not using that kind of language, if you say that you are going to do something for a fairy or for the fae as a whole, you better make sure that you do that thing. And the fairies will always do the same. If you leave a gift and enter a contract, they will always fulfill their end of the bargain. Like I believe I mentioned earlier, right? It's the same thing, right? It's that honesty, that integrity, okay? And they will always keep their word. And that's what they expect from you. So, very important. Never thank a fairy and never say you are sorry to a fairy. The reason behind this is that thanking a fairy, there's a couple reasons why you should never thank a fairy. One, it's considered rude because in their mind that's saying that they owed you something. And even if they did technically by even their terms owe you something, it's still considered rude. Fairies are very sensitive, okay? It's still considered rude to point out to them that they owed you something. All right. Another reason that you should be cautious about thanking a fairy is because you are also admitting, like, if by saying that they owe you something, you are saying you're in contract with them. And so they might take that as, oh, like maybe you still owe me something, Like it can be a tricky thing. You don't want to offend them and you don't want to admit that you owe them anything. So be cautious. Don't ever thank a fairy. You can say, I appreciate your assistance in this matter. They really love manners. So The more polite that you are, the better, but don't outright thank them. Uh, Now, don't say sorry either, because saying sorry to a fairy is you admitting some kind of really deep level of like disrespect or some deep debt that you owe them. So never say that you are sorry to a fairy. If a fairy that you're communicating with points out that you did something wrong, don't apologize. Be like, now I understand. I appreciate you letting me know. Something like that. You know what I mean? So you have to get really good with your word usage when interacting with these beings, because you have to kind of get on their level. You see what I'm saying? Um, so braggarts, never brag. If you do get a gift from a fairy, or if they give you some kind of guidance or advice that was super helpful, whatever, right? Don't talk about it. Don't tell anyone. Keep it to yourself. They don't think about it this way. Fairies are the hidden folk, right? That's one of their many names. And that goes in a lot of ways. It's the same reason that you don't want to try to photograph a fairy, and if you come across fairies in the wilderness, you don't want to sit there and try to like spy on them. They will not be happy about that. They are very private, and it kind of is the same thing with the bragging. And the way I think of it too is, it's the same with witches. A lot of witches do stick around in the broom closet, because if they're too, and that's the thing, you don't want to, first off, you don't want to damage your magic by going and telling people like, oh, I did this spell and it worked. You don't want to cramp your magic, first off, as far as witchcraft goes. But the other reason is that, like, if you're telling people like, oh, I can do all this magic and it's working out really well for me, then you can have, I've literally had this happen. You'll have people coming to you for advice via like tarot readings or whatever, wanting you to do spells for them and all this kind of stuff. And I feel like it's probably the same thing with the Fae in that regard, Like, if you tell people that I did this for you, then I'm going to have all these people trying to ask me for help and whatever, and frankly, I got better things to do. You know what I mean? So, be considerate, and don't be a braggart. And be respectful of fairy privacy. Again, no photographs, and don't spy on them if you come across them. Just keep going. Be safest that way anyway, trust me. So, of course, accepting food or drink from a fairy, and why is this a bad thing? So there's a couple things that I have found in regards to this one. One is that accepting food or drink, you can get trapped in fairy land, and never be able to leave again. But another thing is that if you accept food or drink, it's again one of those contract things. So you might be binding yourself in servitude to that particular fairy you accepted it from. And maybe that's how you get taken to fairyland in the first place and never get to leave. Maybe it's, the same thing. I don't know. I haven't been fairy napped yet. So, oh, this last one is super creepy. But I definitely have to throw it in there. I love the creepy stuff anyway. So, dancing with the Fae is said to lead to madness and or death. Now, seeing fairies dance, I've read different things. I've read that it's not like, watching fairies dance, or that they enjoy, no, excuse me. Fairies enjoy watching humans dance, especially children. It's very joyful to them, but never dance with the Fae yourself, because there is some type of magic to it, I suppose. And this one is a little more mysterious, but also this is where, in my mind, it starts evoking some interesting concepts that I'm definitely going to have to dive deeper into in a later video, because this is already almost at like, I don't know, 15 minutes or something. But this connection that I talked about in my last video between the Fae and the spirits of the dead, right? Fairyland and the underworld, it's the same place, right? They're just different types of spiritual, non-corporeal entities that exist in the realm that the dead go. right? Maybe before reincarnation, who knows what happens, okay? But this is just going off the mythology, right, y'all? So, the madness thing, I have a lot of theories about that. I'm going to dive deeper into that later, but also I think the madness thing might be related to, like, again, in the 411 cases, people who do come back, if they didn't lose time, they have very, very strange stories about where they were and what they saw. And so maybe that's what this madness is that it's, where were you actually? What actually happened, And it can, our human brains can only handle so much. So, of course, people would be likely to go insane a little bit. I probably would. The death thing, though, again, like it's the underworld, right? It's these people that go missing in areas that are mythologically spoken of as being portals and entrances into the underworld, which is the same thing as fairy. And so it just makes me wonder, like, are these people who are being kidnapped by fairies, are they all dying? Are they, like, what happens? What about the ones that come back? If they're going to the underworld, if they're going to the land of the dead, essentially, does that mean you can just come back from it and still be an immortal body? Just have lost a little bit of, like, what does that mean? It's really weird shit. I know this is probably sounding a bit off the rails, but I don't really care. This is such a fun and interesting topic. I've been rambling long enough. Iron. So, if you're ever out in the wilderness, in general, maybe, you should just keep a little bit of iron on yourself. Because for whatever reason, I don't know why. If you know, tell me, help me. Um, but for whatever reason, fairies are extremely allergic to iron. So keep some of that on you. It might help you out. But yeah, I want to look more into that one too. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you for listening to this fascinating topic and going through it with me. And I will see y'all very soon. Please like, share, subscribe, yada yada, all that stuff for more fairy themed videos.